Welcome back. In this video, I would like to talk a little bit more about layers. Let's begin. By now, we should be familiar with the Spirit Animal document. What I would like to do is grab my Layers tab and bring my entire panel inside my window so we can get a better look at it. Now, if you pull your Layer tab into this window and it's small, you can resize that panel by just grabbing your cursor and grabbing the very edge of the window, and then that's going to change your cursor into a double arrow and you can resize your window up and down, or you can grab a corner and enlarge it this way. This document here has 7 layers. You can see that the background layer is locked. By default, all new documents start with a background layer that is locked. And what that means is when it is locked, it can't be moved to any other position. Now what you can do is just click on that lock, unlock it. You can reposition that layer anywhere you would like. If you've unlocked it and want it locked again, then you just click on the lock again and it is locked. When I start working in Photoshop on a new document, I go ahead, unlock it, and then never lock it again. Having your background layer locked, something Photoshop has done from the beginning of time. I don't find it all that necessary, but you might find it comforting. Anytime that I click on one of these layers and it highlights itself in gray, that is called the target layer. When I'm clicked on the human, I can use my move tool and move that layer. When I'm clicked on the object, I can move the pile of sod she's sitting on. 90% of the time in Photoshop, when something's not working, we are not on the correct target layer. Now, if we want to create a new layer, we can come to this little flyout window. When we click on new layer, a new window comes up and then we can name it. I'm just going to name it test. I'm going to say OK. Then that new blank layer comes to the top of the stack. And then resize that just a little bit more so we can see all of our layers. To delete this layer, we can right click on our mouse and select delete layer. And then it's going to ask us if you want to delete the layer. You say yes. I'm going to go Command Z to undo that. So now our test layer is back. The easiest way to delete a layer is simply hit delete on the keyboard. If we want to get that layer back, we can either Command Z to undo that. I'm going to delete it again. Or we can come into the history panel and then bring that back. All right, I'm going to delete it again. We can hide any one of these layers by clicking on the eyeball. So I've just removed the antlers, the butterfly, the human. We can reposition these layers by just moving them. I can move the woman on top of the butterfly so it looks like the wings are behind her. I can move the hands above and it looks like they're coming out of her shoulders. You can simply reposition the layers to affect the image. Keep in mind, if you move the background layer to the very top, you have blocked out all of the other layers because this one is a fully opaque layer and the rest of them are on transparencies. They're still there. They're just being hidden by that top layer. If I move it down halfway, you will see some of the items come back. If I move it all the way to the bottom, that's where we were. Just know, background layer is fully opaque and everything else is on a transparency. You may see these checkerboards. This is a transparency, or you might have your Photoshop set to be a white transparency instead of seeing checkerboards. All right, I'm going to turn back on the background. I can also duplicate a layer by dragging it to this little icon here, which is the same one where we can create a new layer. So I'm just going to grab the butterfly, drag it right into that button at the bottom, and now I have 2 butterflies. So I'm going to use my move tool to move one here and one here. Click on the next layer and change it to here. So now we have 2 layers. I can change the opacity of these layers. So I'm going to select the layer that I want, come into the opacity, and I can click on that little arrow and then just change the opacity. Then I can select the next one and change the opacity there as well. To name the files, by default, let me create a new layer to show you. A new layer is called layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. So if you want to rename it, you'll double click on the name and then name it anything you want. Then hit return. Delete that one. If you want to merge a couple of layers, let's say that we want these butterflies on one layer. Move this one down just a little bit. So let's just say that we want these butterflies on one layer. We're going to select both layers. So I'm going to select the first one and then Command select the second one. So both of these are now a target layer. And I'm going to go into this drop-down menu, click, and then select Merge Layers. So what's going to happen now is that, let me turn off all of these things here. 2 layers of the butterflies are now one, and if I move them, they now move together instead of independently because we have now merged those 2 layers. And when I'm working, I might start off with, like if we were doing something like this, the spirit animal assignment, I might start off with 10, 15 layers, but I'll merge it down to like 7, depending on my workflow. All right, so let me bring these other layers back. There's some other organizing techniques that you might be interested in, and it's called grouping. I can go into the drop-down menu, go to New Group. I can name that group. I'm going to name it Human for my human parts. Click OK. And then a folder will pop up in my layers, and I'm going to move that to the very top just for my organization purposes. And then I can grab my human, drop it in there, and I can grab the human arms and drop it in that folder. And now these 2 items are in a folder that I can collapse or expand. Feel free to use this as an organization when you're working. You may have up to 20, 30 layers in your documents. Being able to group them in a folder might be really helpful. To remove them from a group, you just pull them out like that. And if you want to get rid of this, and right-click on your mouse and then select Delete Group. Okay, so I'm going to reset this entire document by coming into the History panel and clicking on this icon here, and this takes me to the very beginning. What I'd like to show you now is the Auto Select. Click on the Move tool, and if I'm on the right targeted layer, I can move that object. Then I have to click over the human, move the human, click over to the sod, move the sod. That becomes very tedious to go back and forth, and one thing you may want to consider is once you're in the Move tool options bar up here at the top, you can select Auto Select, check that little box, and then Photoshop is smart enough to know sometimes what object you're trying to move. If you're directly on the object, then it's automatically figuring it out. But sometimes if you're not close enough, it's going to move the background layer or a different layer. So I wasn't directly on the woman, I was slightly over to the side, and so I moved the background. So this auto select works about 80% of the time, but sometimes areas get a little fussy, and when that happens, just deselect the auto select and then go back to the conventional way of clicking on the target layer and moving objects around. All right, I'm going to reset this document. And now we're back to the beginning. The last thing I want to talk about is flattening layers, which is really important to understand that it is different than merging layers. Merging layers will take 2, 3, 4 layers and merge them together. So let me just show you that again. So I'm going to select these 4 files. I'm going to come into this drop-down menu and I'm going to select Merge Layers. So now all of these layers are on one layer because I have merged those 3. Now flattening is very different. I'm going to go into that drop-down menu again. I'm going to flatten image, and it's going to get rid of all of my layers. Very rarely you will ever want to do this. There are some techniques we're going to run into later in the class where you're going to want to flatten your entire layer. But when you're working like this, you're always going to want to save a copy of your document and flatten that copy. You never want to flatten your original document, because if you save this flattened document, you'll never get back to the original layers, and then you're no longer working in a non-destructive editing process. All right, well that is layers, and take care.